What if I told you that the problem with your writing is not that you're a bad writer, but that you know too much? I ran a university writing lab for 7 years, and these days I work with nonfiction writers of all stripes, but the problem is the same. The patterns that experts use to think about their subject fight with the patterns that readers use to understand it. And that fight has a name. It's called interference, and it's the number one problem of expert writing. So in this video, I'm going to show you why experts write the worst, how to spot interference patterns in your own writing, and how to fix them so that your ideas are as clear to your readers as they are to you. So what is interference and why does it happen? Well, quite simply, interference is the mismatch between the patterns that you use when you're generating the text and the patterns that readers use whenever they're interpreting the text. See, that's the thing. If you're writing valuably, then the kind of thinking that you're doing is way too complex to sort out in your head. It's a little bit like Christmas lights. So you can imagine having a set of Christmas lights that you pull out once a year and hang up around the house. And you know how it is. They're always a tangled mess. And before you can actually put them on display, you need to go through this toilsome process of untangling everything. And that's really what the first phase of writing is. Whenever you're writing, it's not like an essay shape or whatever genre you're using. It's not in that shape in your head. It's a total mess. And you can't just go for a walk and sort that mess out. It doesn't happen that way. You need to, in the first place, use the writing as an extension of your thinking. And if you do expert writing, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you're sitting at the keyboard and you're kind of struggling to figure out what it even is that you think before you can even think about putting it into an essay shape for a reader. And so one way to diagram that would be to say that you're generating, so here's the text that you and your reader are both going to use, and you're generating it on this horizontal axis of time, where you're simultaneously thinking about the world and writing about the world. And so the text is being generated according to these patterns, where you, as an expert, are thinking about the world. But the problem with that is that readers are using the text on a completely different axis. They want to use the text to understand the world. So if you think about that expert writing process, you're kind of moving through the text in time. Think about it this way. You, as the writer, start at the top of the text with a question or a problem, something that you don't know because you're generating new ideas. And so you start at the top of the text not knowing, and you kind of keep on chipping away at this draft until you get to the bottom of the text where you're like, aha, I've got it. Now it's complete. But look at the pattern that you've just generated. You've moved from a state of not knowing, a state of uncertainty, to a state of certainty or knowing. And so now if you just hand this off to your reader, they need to follow your entire intellectual journey from not knowing to knowing. Now that's just one example of a writer pattern that doesn't serve readers. You're not making a mistake. Everybody goes through this. But the thing to just recognize is that you are, as you're generating this text, you are simultaneously thinking about the world with your own expert patterns. We're going to talk about those in a second, but those patterns make it difficult for the reader to use your text. And it's not to just say that the patterns that writers use and readers use are different. It's to say that the patterns that writers use, especially experts, which they use to generate the text, interfere with the patterns, the expectations that readers use to process the text. Readers do not want to move from uncertainty to certainty, for example. They want the certainty right up front. And if you want an easy guide to the patterns that readers use to process your text, then you can grab my visual guide to expert writing down below the like button. It's 4 pages as a PDF, and it just gives you a kind of roadmap to looking at your essay and thinking about it the way that readers will. These aren't like my rules to writing. These are just the kind of expectations that readers bring to nonfiction writing. It's all based on reader psychology, and so if you can think about your text this way, then it becomes really easy to move from that first phase of writing, where you as the writer are generating the text while thinking about it, transferring that over to the reader's draft. But how can you spot interference in your own writing? Well, you might think that one way that you could find it would be to give your text to readers and see what they give you back. But honestly, I think readers are the worst people to talk to for feedback about your draft. The reason that you don't ask readers for feedback about your draft is for the same reason that you don't ask a fish how to catch a fish, or you don't ask a woman for dating advice if you're a man. Ladies, do not pillory me in the comments for this, but let me tell you that the worst dating advice I've ever received has always come from women. Why is that? Well, I don't know for sure, but what I do know for sure is that what you say you want and what you actually want are two different things. I had a girl one time tell me that she wanted a guy just like in the movie About Time. Have you ever seen this movie? So I heard this and I watched this movie, and here's the movie. It's about this dork who just can't figure it out with women. But in the movie, he's got a time machine. And so every time he fumbles the football, he can just hit undo and go back in time and try it again. And the entire movie is him just fumbling. And girls watch that and they melt and they say, oh, see, that's what I want. Well, guys, go out there and try it. Watch that movie, use it like a playbook, and see how that works for you. And honestly, it works the same way with readers. They'll tell you one thing, but what they actually want is another thing. So when your text doesn't work with readers, here's what they'll tell you. They'll say, it's unclear. They'll say, oh, it's disorganized. It's a little fuzzy. It's dense. Remember back in university when your professor would leave you a comment in the margins that says, unclear, fix this? The problem here is that readers don't have the vocabulary to describe what's happening. So honestly, like if you receive a comment like dense or unclear or disorganized, that advice is really worth nothing. It doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you the way that the reader is experiencing the text. Readers don't have this language of saying, like, your writing patterns interfere with my reading patterns. And just understand that these words, dense, unclear, disorganized, and those other kind of general terms that you get in feedback about your writing, those describe the symptom of your writing, but they don't describe the cause. What they're describing, in other words, is friction. The readers want to move through your text. They want to process it according to their reading patterns, but those patterns are interfering with the patterns that you've left on the page. One example that I've already provided is your own intellectual journey from uncertainty to certainty. That's a pattern that's going to interfere with the reader's patterns. Readers don't want to move from uncertainty to certainty. They want to move from stability to instability. And that's a different video, but it's just one of the reader's kind of preferred motions or journeys through a text. They want to begin in a familiar world and then discover that there's something wrong with that world that they need to understand better. That's one of the reader's kind of expectations whenever they come to a piece of nonfiction. So readers, a lot like women in the dating market, don't have the best language for describing what it is they want. So if you get negative feedback from them, take it all with a grain of salt and try to get to the bottom of what it is that readers actually want. And this concept of interference is really important for writers to understand, because when you get that negative feedback from readers, you don't want to wind up having to work on the wrong thing. I'm actually working with a writer right now who's writing a pillar essay for a coaching program that he's about to launch. And so the essay is kind of meant to introduce potential customers and the internet at large to a concept that he's kind of owning in his personal brand. And again, he's building a coaching educational offer on the other end of it. But so what he's done now, this is a very kind of niche topic, and I've been working with him on this draft. Now, he, like many writers, whenever they come to me, thought that the problem would just be a matter of line editing. So he would bring me his draft and I would apply some patterns to it, and turn it into a draft that works. But it doesn't really work that way. Like, I really think it's important to think about the writer's draft and the reader's draft as two separate documents. You have one draft where you, as the expert, are thinking about the world, you're thinking about your ideas as you're generating the text. But then that text is going to mirror your own patterns of thinking, which involve a lot of confusion and kind of recursive looping in on itself and fixing this and getting pulled down that side trail and trying this out. There's a lot of experimentation and kind of iteration over, however long it takes you to generate the text, many days at least, that goes into it. And so you can't really fix that at the level of line editing. I really think it's important, like once you as the writer are satisfied, to walk away from that text. And that's really hard to do because you've invested so much of yourself into it. Working with this writer's draft, it's a little bit like giving directions to a restaurant to a friend. So imagine you're at a restaurant, your friend's gonna come meet you, you've driven to the restaurant from your house, and now your friend calls you and they're asking for directions, right? So what are you gonna do? Are you gonna tell your friend the steps that you took to arrive at the restaurant? That's not very helpful to your friend, right? Your friend is expecting you to start your directions where you understand they are, and to give them the appropriate level of context to let them know how to get to the place where you've arrived, right? You use the text just like you arrived at the restaurant following your own path, and that path served you well. Nothing wrong with the path that you've taken. It's the steps that you needed to take in order to arrive at this place of clarity. But now you need to show the reader how to get there. And you're an expert. The reader is not starting their journey to the restaurant from your home. You're starting from a completely different walk of life. You have all these other experiences, background knowledge, and just patterns of thinking that do not suit the reader's patterns of thinking. And so in most cases, whenever an expert brings me a text that they're preparing for a specific kind of reader, I think it's really hard for them emotionally to accept that they need to write a new draft. But honestly, that draft isn't really so hard to write once you've done all your thinking. Like once you've arrived at a place where you think, okay, I have all the pieces that I need, then it's actually a lot easier to map out a trail for the reader to get there. And the visual guide to expert writing is basically a collection of all the patterns that I use whenever I'm thinking about how to prepare a reader to go from where they are to where you want them to be. Why is it that the more that you know about a topic, the worse a writer you become? Well, on the one hand, of course, you're the one person in the world who should be writing about your topic because you're an expert on it. But on the other hand, because you're an expert, you have compressed a lot of your knowledge into really tight kind of conceptual packets and heuristics that become shorthands for you, but become very dense and difficult to manage for people who don't know what you know. And this is popularly known as the curse of knowledge. But I don't want to use that phrase because honestly, for those of us who are in the space of writing, that itself becomes one of these condensed packets of information. And I think it's not exactly what I'm trying to say. The popular associations that we have with the curse of knowledge, in case you're not familiar, this is a concept that comes from C.S. Lewis, and it basically just means that you as a writer forget what it's like to not know what you already know. And so the advice that follows from this insight about the curse of knowledge is to write simply or write at a 5th grade level. And that's not the takeaway that I want to make, which is why I don't really want to use that concept, the curse of knowledge. Instead, I want to look at this issue afresh to really think about what happens when you're an expert. So whatever it is, whatever the field is that you're writing it, whatever it is your domain of expertise, The fact that you have expertise in that domain means that you have gone through a lot of learning and condensing of information. Like when you learn something, you only need to learn it one time, and then that becomes a kind of landmark or a post in the road for you from where you can begin the next time you're learning. In other words, you start thinking about your concept using these compressed kind of chunks of information that become like the private machinery of your discipline. You know these concepts really well, you take them for granted, and there are other people who are in your space, colleagues, like especially if you're an academic. Now, it's true of all disciplines, but it's just easy to think about this among academics. I worked with a lot of academics for 7 years at the Writing Center, and what I found is that these people are generally writing for each other. And so there are all these kind of concepts and disciplinary norms that we take for granted whenever we're writing to those people. But now, whenever you're tasked with the problem of making your research valuable to people who are not inside your discourse community, which might be the lay public if you're trying to write a popular book, but it could also be committees who are issuing grants or funding or, private investors, that kind of thing. You need to make the value of your research salient to them, and you forget what it's like to not know everything that you know. So in one sense, it means that, yes, there's a lot that you take for granted, and so therefore you should present these items simply, but it's more to say that as an expert, you don't even realize the amount of compression and the kind of weird thinking patterns that you use within your discipline. And they're ones that you take for granted among your peers, but whenever you're writing for people who are outside of that disciplinary community, it's important to think about what patterns are they going to be using to interpret this, because those are the patterns that you need to use whenever you're trying to reach those readers. And so the fix here is the advice that unfortunately, you really don't want to hear, but it's the truth, which is that you can't think of writing as being a single act. If you're an expert, if you are writing valuably, if you are generating new knowledge, you're not just regurgitating other people's ideas, you're not doing summaries of other people's ideas, but you're actually trying to communicate something valuable, which means you're solving current problems. Right? If you are solving open problems, if you're answering open questions, it means you are using your writing as an extension of your thinking. And so by definition, as an expert, you are going to be generating your text along this axis where you are simultaneously thinking about the world and solving these problems while you are generating that text. And so therefore, you must get used to the idea that there's no fixing that draft. There's no amount of line edits, put a comma here, put these two things into the same paragraph. It doesn't work. We can't fix these issues at the surface level, at the formal level. It's a fundamental issue of the way that this text was generated. It was generated to serve your own thinking. But if you're trying to reach readers, if you're trying to mobilize your expertise into something that readers will find valuable, then we need to generate a second text. I should almost draw a second one over here. Here's the one for the reader, and they're going to use this to understand the world, right? This one is full of interference. They can't use it. It was generated for you. And so after we're done this one, we need to create a second one for the reader that they can use. But here's one kind of concrete tip that you can use whenever you are trying to fix these problems of interference. So of course, grab that PDF, but then one thing you'll notice in it is that I have this, I'm always referring to this fractal pattern called the index and the discussion. And so that's kind of a general shape of idea development. The index is where you put a kind of high-level concept, and the discussion is where you pay that off. And I call it a fractal pattern because it's a pattern that recurs at every level of resolution throughout the text. So we see that index and discussion pattern at the level of the entire text where you have your introduction and then the body. But then when you zoom into the parts of the body, you see that there's the index and discussion here. And the tip is to do what's called the skim test. And so once you've kind of laid out your ideas into this index discussion pattern, what you can do is highlight just the index positions and see whether those create a kind of storyboard for the major steps or rhetorical moves that you want the reader to move through. Because the index is supposed to preview the major piece of information in the entire unit of discourse. And so the way that you can test that as a kind of diagnostic is to see whether just the index positions tell a coherent story. And so that skim test amounts to what's known as a reverse outline, right? You don't really want to, of course, a common piece of advice is to create an outline for your text. But the problem with that is that if you create the outline first, then it's hard to fit, especially expert patterns. Like as an expert, you're not just writing listicles, right? You're not writing top 5 things. And so it's hard to generate an outline first and then fill it in because, again, you're using writing as an extension of your thinking. So one idea comes and then you kind of expand it and start exploring it. And then that might take you down a little tributary and you go down that path. And right, so it doesn't really work so well if you're trying to generate an outline first. So what I recommend instead is use your writing in whatever patterns it occurs to you spontaneously. Like, let your mind wander while you're writing. Absolutely do not think about reading patterns while you're generating your text. But then as you start to adapt the weird thing that you've developed that served your own thinking, when you start adapting that for readers, you do need to make sure that there's a kind of coherent structure to it all. And so the way that you can do that is with this reverse outline, right? You can look at your text and then draw lines demarcating the different sections. And then within those sections, draw a line that demarcates what's known as the index. And then look only at those indexes and see whether they tell a coherent story. And if, as you're generating this reverse outline, you cannot really label a part, well, it's probably still a tangled knot of Christmas lights, or it's just fluff, right? Ideally, these indexes throughout the piece are going to mark the major turns in your reader's journey. If you go back to the metaphor about the reader finding their way to the restaurant, right? These index positions should be like the major turns that they're going to take on the way to the destination. But you can't really map out the reader's route if you don't know what patterns they'll use to get there. So be sure to watch this video next because it's going to show you the 5 reading patterns that, if you follow them, is going to make your writing so much better from the reader's perspective. So be sure to go check it out.